My name is Mark Rae. I'm Executive Director of the Grace Center for Spiritual Development, and I want to welcome you, all of you listeners, to the Grace Cafe. I have a really, really special guest today. He may look a little bit like me because he's related to me. He is my brother, Dr. Scott Rae. Welcome. Glad you are here. Let me do a
Thank
quick
you.
introduction.
You didn't say
on you.
that I was the better looking of the two. So
Well, certainly older.
listen,
Which
we
we
need
won't
to have a mutually assured destruction pact here.
That's right. Yeah, we're gonna leave that one alone. Scott is the senior advisor to the president of Biola. He is the dean of faculty at Talbot Seminary. He is the professor of philosophy and Christian ethics, author of how many books now? 10, 11, 12?
15.
15. 15. Lost count. There have been a few of them.
You're excused.
And really kind of a topical expert on things like biblical ethics and faith and work, those specific areas of influence. You've also been on the board of a number of medical institutions, hospitals, giving them biblical counsel on how to make some of the critical decisions in the medical path. But we want to talk today about a number of different things related to the whole issue of faith and work. Again, you are one of those sought-after speakers on this really interesting topic of faith and work. And I want to ask you, because you have spent time in the church, you have spent time in the business world, you have spent time in academia, the issue of faith and work, where did your interest in that come? How did you get interested in this issue? And we'll talk about the issue in just a minute, but how did you get interested in the issue of faith and work?
Well, mainly it started because my field in ethics, I've been teaching business ethics for a long time. And so any kind of Christian integration of faith in the workplace or faith and ethics in the workplace, it's sort of the very first building block that you have to get right has to do with connecting the dots on faith and work in general. If you don't get that right, then I think the rest of it's sort of a moot point. I think to be a little more specific too, a lot of this came from just watching our dad's experience.
Yeah.
With his business. He was what I would call a serial salesman who could sell just about anything to anybody. And I don't know, you may remember this too. I think I may have been 11 or 12 when he sat around the dinner table with us and announced to us that he was cashing out everything that he had set aside for our college educations to start this new company.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember that, but I wasn't super financially savvy at the time, but I knew we were really up a creek if the company didn't go well.
If it didn't go well, I don't know if you remember this, but then he had his entire briefcase full of the documents to start this company, and he drove off, and then an entire briefcase fell off, and he never found it. So he had to somehow, back before the time of computers, had to recreate all of those beginning documents. Yeah.
About that. Anyway, they mom and dad both came to faith a little bit later in life, but they were involved in a really terrific Bible teaching church for a very long time. And yet the discussions I would have with dad, the only dots he ever connected between his Christian faith and his business was that, churches collect revenue, they don't generate it. So somebody's got to be out there generating revenues so that in his view, the stuff that really mattered to God, which was what pastors and missionaries were doing, could be funded.
Right. It's a fairly common, common school of thought that the pastoral work, that's the work of God. The secular work this is what helps fund the work of God. And your study in this area, and you and I had these discussions 10, 15 years ago, your study in this area that couldn't be more wrong. That basic premise couldn't be more wrong biblically. Talk about that for just a minute.
Well, I think, we sort of, I think we forget that one of the great legacies of the Reformation was the doing away with that distinction between the sacred and the secular.
Right.
And the reformers were right. Some of them actually gave their lives in opposition to that dichotomy. But and it's a little bit oversimplified, but for the most part, up until the Reformation, priests, nuns, and monks had callings, and everybody else, they were the slugs that had jobs to support the people who not only were doing the stuff that mattered to God, but the things that actually put them farther ahead on the
Yep.
road to meriting their salvation.
Right.
And so when Luther comes along and advocates the priesthood of all believers, that drives a stake right into the heart of that medieval view of salvation. What we have done, I think, is we've reconfigured that, and it's not that this that being in the pastorate or on the mission field gets somebody further along toward meriting their salvation. What we say is that those are the things that have eternal significance.
Right.
And what goes
Yeah.
on in the workplace does not.
So
I think.
So go ahead.
Well, biblically, but I think both the creation mandate, which God ordained work in Genesis 2, not
Right.
3, and that's for your listeners, that one chapter distinction makes a really big difference.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, that even if most people are aware that God ordained work before the entrance of sin, most people approach their work as though it was ordained in Genesis 3,
Yes.
viewing their work as their penalty, which,
Right.
in my view, that sort of explains why most people I know are in the business world are working as hard as they can to make as much money as fast as they can so they can retire as soon as they can and do anything else that they think has more value to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you look at how God ordained that in Genesis 2, work was really significant in paradise. God called Adam and Eve to work as a means of establishing dominion over creation. And then when the Lord returns, we will still be working because they beat their swords into plowshares,
Right.
and their spears into prune. The implements of war are transformed into the implements of productive work.
Yeah.
And that, the average person who's, slugging it out in business probably won't appreciate the fact that when the Lord returns, we will all still be working. But I think the Bible's pretty clear about that.
That there's an eternity of work from the Lord, mandated from the Lord. Again, we go back to the original Genesis mandate, which is tend my garden.
Right.
Tend my creation. Let me ask you, if you carry this forward to a New Testament, go ahead.
Before you leave that, the Hebrew word for tend is the word avodah, which is translated as frequently as work. It's also translated repeatedly throughout the Hebrew Bible as worship. And I think,
which now puts a whole different spin on it. Yeah.
I don't think that's an accident.
So to carry that stream, then what you're saying is that there is an element to this, especially out of the Hebrew scriptures, that your work could be likened unto worship, that as you do your work, it is a form of worship unto the Lord. Am I hearing you say that?
Yes, that's precisely the case. Now, let's be clear.
So carry.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. We're still on this thread.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, it's not like our work hadn't been impacted by sin, which it has. But I think it's important to recognize that God cursed the ground. He didn't curse work.
Right.
In Genesis 3. And those are two different things.
And that's why I want to move you forward. Go to a Pauline look at this thing. Go to Ephesians 2. And what that doesn't say, it says we are created in Christ Jesus. We're his workmanship, created for good works, and that there is no distinction that those are only spiritual good works.
Right. That's exactly.
Is that
right.
correct?
In fact, that is correct. The term ergon that's used for work, created for good works, is the primary term in the New Testament that's used for the work that you do for compensation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's important we distinguish between there's work for compensation and work for contribution, so that even people who aren't getting a paycheck are still working. And
There's still a contribution, right?
there's no categories in the scripture for retirement, where you
Right.
just go sit on a desert island somewhere. I think the clearest place this comes out is in Paul's teaching in Colossians 3, where
Okay.
it's in verses 20, 23 and 24. In whatever you do, which admittedly that's a pretty big umbrella. And whatever you do, do your work heartily as unto the Lord.
Right.
Or later on, for parentheses, in whatever you do, here's the punchline, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving.
Yes.
And the term there to serve is the same term that we translate as to minister. It's the term to diakonia.
Right.
And I actually think if we used the term service instead of ministry to describe what we do in the workplace, we'd have an easier time wrapping our arms around it. Because that's why if we say all believers are in full-time ministry, we think pastors and missionaries.
That's right.
But if we say all believers are in full-time service, that's a little easier concept to grasp.
Well, but let me even take that to a different. Having been in business for almost 20 years before I went into
you better
ministry,
say that right,
into service before I went into full-time service over here. There was this
changed arenas of service.
Yes, there was this frame of reference that my work was. I never looked at that work from a sacred standpoint. And one of the things that you showed me a number of years ago was that God needs, not that God needs anything, but theologically there is a need from God's viewpoint for work to be done, for tending the garden, and He has delegated that privilege to His creation to tend His garden. Now, tending His garden, serving Him, takes a tremendous number of people, and in all certain levels. There's all sorts of tending, from harvesting to planting to watering to whatever it might be. And if we put it in the context of work today, it is those who are lawyers and doctors and oil field workers and seminary professors, and there is a broad scope of service, and so it is this it's this mentality that says, here's how I view my work, and here's how I view my work as ministry. It's the place where I go to share Christ. But what you have showed me in the past is this: it's beyond that. That work, even in the secular world, that secular work is a place of ministry. It's a place of service unto God, because God says that work needs to be done. I've given you that work.
I often ask business people, they tell me about your ministry in the workplace.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Great question.
They say, I pray for my coworkers. If I have a chance to share Christ with them, I take it. If their life's falling apart, I'll have compassion on them. At which point I point out to them, those are all good things, but those are all things that you are doing when you are not doing your job.
Yeah.
Which, if you actually do much of those things, you run the risk of actually doing something unethical, which I would refer to as theft from your employer. Because if the employer doesn't pay you to do that, I realize God's our master on that. But I think the big shift that we have to make in the way we educate people on this is to show that the very work itself is a part, not all of it. It's a part of their service to God. And by doing so,
in essence, that raises the value.
It does. And by doing so, they enrich their communities and enable people to flourish. And see, part of this too stems from, I think, a defective view of what a human being is too. Because we are more than just souls on a stick. Our bodies matter. The incarnation
Yes.
tells us that the body matters. And our salvation is not just for our own well-being, it's for the life of the world. The incarnation
Yes.
tells us that Christ came to save the world. All of creation's groaning for its redemption, which suggests that all of it's going to be redeemed at some point. And so it's a bigger picture of what counts for the work of God in the world and what matters for eternity.
Well, and what I love about that
Remember,
viewpoint
Colossians
is
3
that,
was written.
go ahead, go. Colossians 3 was written what?
Remember, Colossians 3 was written to household servants.
Right.
Verse 22 says, "Slaves obey your masters." Slaves, whatever you do, slaves, whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. So even the stuff that we might think is just meaningless grunt work, still valuable to God.
And to that extent, now move that forward to Philemon, and you get this wonderful balance of how Paul looked at somebody who is considered a master, somebody who is considered a slave, and said, because of Christ, you're on the same playing field. That's, boy, you talk about radical for that time, and that's even for us today. That's still a radical approach. That's the commonality, and it's the commonality of what Christ did for us, not my work, not my service. It is the commonality of Christ. And so let me shift this just for a second. What that does is it places a higher value on, excuse me for saying this way, but it places a high value on secular work beyond you got to earn money so you can go support the priests, support the ministers. There is which also says, if God values that work, then he also values your experience, your abilities, your gifts, and all of the things that are appropriated here. He values those as well. Correct?
After all, he's the one who gave them to you.
Sure. But he didn't give them to you specifically that only for sacred work. He gave them to us to operate well in the secular world.
That's right.
Yeah.
You see, here's the way we try to explain to our seminary students is we say, look, most churches do a great job of preparing people to pay attention to a very small minority of their lives. What we want you to be able to do is to help people pay attention to what they do with the vast majority of their lives, which is what basically, for the most part, is what they do in the workplace.
Right.
But most people in our churches, they want to leave their work so that they can go serve the Lord full time.
Yeah.
And I say, what did you think you had been doing all this time?
That's where you've been in the ministry field the whole time.
Right. Now, here's one thing. We're trying to help our students, our next generation of pastors on this. I think we need to do a better job of explaining to our folks, what is the ministry of accounting? What's the ministry of the service of finance, of marketing, of sales, of plumbing, of fast food service, all of those things. And we need to keep this from being just a white collar thing. But explain to them how that works, other than giving myself a platform to present the gospel, which is all true and all good, but that's only a slice of it, and you're missing the rest of it.
And if I only see that, if I only see my work as that, then the value of that work, the value of the work I do gets diminished in comparison to I'm only here to do this work. Yeah,
right.
And that's not what God says. He says there's value in that work.
I think there's an integrity problem with someone who says, I am only in this workplace to do exactly the things that my employer is not paying me for.
Well, which also then puts a light on your testimony of Christ. If you're in essence a theft of time, you're not a good worker. And there is value in that obedience to what Christ says. Be my representative in the workplace. In fact, I've put it this way: when I was in pastoral, when I was actually leading a church, and it was, you may spend 2, 3, 4, 5 hours a week at church, but you spend 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week at work. Where do you think Christ is going to show up to teach you the lessons of how to live with him and how to live for him. It's going to be in your place of work. That's where the focus is.
See, this may come as a surprise to lots of pastors, but I think the workplace is the primary place where people are spiritually formed.
It's certainly where they're spiritually challenged.
Just by virtue, well, I think if they're paying attention, it's also where they're spiritually formed. And we tell our seminary students that the primary role a pastor has is to help your people have their antenna up in the workplace so you can actually perceive the things that God's doing through you and in you in the workplace.
But is that not also
moving too fast to do that?
Yeah, and is that not also the job of the church to equip for the work there, to equip to serve him there? We can serve each other in the church body, and that's wonderful. But where the real, let me rephrase that. I don't want to use that word, but where there is an extension of us is really in that workplace, and that's what we're being equipped for. And that workplace can be your neighborhood. I mean, you're just as much at work when you're with your neighbors as you are at your workplace.
Right. It's just I say all of us have multiple arenas of service,
right,
to which we're called to simultaneously. That's what a vocation. A vocation is an arena of service to which you are called.
Okay.
I would not equate vocation with occupation.
So speak to that for just a moment, because you just said something that I think many people might take a little bit of they might step you back for just a minute and say, wait a minute, are you saying I was called to my vocation? I was called to my work?
I certainly hope so.
I mean, I was called to be an accountant. I was called to be a lawyer. I was called to be a landscape artist.
Why wouldn't you be?
I'm just
why if the priesthood of all believers is true, then why do we think it's only pastors and missionaries who have a call?
Well, and that's what I'm saying is that's a paradigm shift. That's a huge paradigm shift, especially for congregants who come to church and think, I'm a CEO or I'm an employee of this company during the week, but here my service is only good enough to go greet people at the door, or to serve coffee. So what would you tell pastors along this line? What would you speak to? What would you speak to a pastor about? How would you then reshift your approach to your congregation, to your workforce congregation?
Well, the first thing I would say is go visit people in their places of work and actually learn something about what your people actually do during the week and the challenges they face. My friend Tom Nelson, who's a pastor in Kansas City, described one of his last pastoral visits was to a hospital, but he was not there to visit the patient. He said, my last hospital visit, I scrubbed in, and I stood next to the thoracic surgeon in the operating room for 4 hours. At the end of it, the surgeon told him, he said, I've never before had a pastor who cared this much about my work.
Yeah.
I assure you, the next time Tom talks about work from the pulpit, that surgeon's going to be paying attention, and Tom's got a level of street cred that he didn't have before.
Yeah.
Here's a second thing that I would do. I would commission business people to their full-time ministry in the marketplace. I do it publicly, I do it regularly, and I do
That's
it
a
in
great
the church.
idea. Yeah.
The third thing I would do is I would close every church service with a benediction from the end of the 90th Psalm, which is a prayer that says, Lord, establish the work of our hands. I send you out with the prayer that, Lord, establish the work of your hands.
Those three things could help begin to facilitate that paradigm shift in our churches, where instead of a pastor saying, yes, I'll meet with you, come to my office, even if it's I'll meet you at a Starbucks, I'll meet you away from the office where we're actually engaging with in community, in society. That's a, we're not sitting in this. Granted, there's some counseling situations where you ought to do that, but if I'm going to meet with people, I ought to be meeting with them where they are.
Right. Right.
Because guess what? Other people see you. I mean, just like you've said with Tom Nelson, other people recognize that.
Here's the other thing I would suggest to pastors, and that is make sure your language matches your theology.
Okay,
I would
expand
stop
on
talking. I would say I would never again refer to pastors or missionaries as being in full-time ministry. Just think about how the business person hears that when they walk into our church. They conclude that they're either in half-time or no-time ministry, and neither of those things are true theologically. Yeah. I would never try never to use the term ministry without some sort of qualifier that designates the specific arena of service. So pastors are in church ministry.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that's the qualifier.
So a qualifier. I would stop talking about secular jobs because if this is my Father's world, then all of life is sacred. In fact, I get a kick out of people they say, can you tell me how I can take God to work?
Yeah.
My seminary, and I say, you're seriously asking me that question? Aren't you aware that God happens to be already there and well out in front of you?
He's there. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. But that is the separation that has been that's been delineated, that there is value here, there's less value here.
Yeah. Here's the way I'd put it. They see it's often seen that in the pastorate and the mission field, those have intrinsic value.
Yeah.
The rest of it has instrumental value. It has value because can be used. It's a jumping off place to accomplish something else that's more valuable. And that's what we're suggesting. What your work in the workplace has intrinsic value to God, simply by virtue of what it is you're doing. That's really the point.
Okay, so I have a quick question. The church should not have offices for pastors. I know a pastor who declined an office so he can continue to meet at places of business. What do you think about that?
I think that's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
As long as, I mean, you need some place to have your books and resources.
Yeah.
I think to your point, there's probably also a place to have something for, those conversations that really need to be very private and behind closed doors. And there's,
right.
So as long as I got a place for that, sweet.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me kind of bring this around to a conclusion here. Final question for you. How then is a gifted workplace person, I'm not sure if I'm describing it, but you understand what I mean. How is a gifted workplace person who is not clergy valuable to the church?
Well, that's too narrow a question. I mean, I'll answer the narrow question, but it depends on their gift. I mean, they can often bring their giftedness into the service local church. I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Although we should probably warn both pastors and marketplace folks that doesn't always go well, because churches and businesses are fundamentally two different kinds of things that have two different sets of goals. But I think the better question is, how does my work in the marketplace, how is that kingdom service?
That's a great question.
That's the way I put it. Okay. Let me tell you a quick story to answer that. Okay. Several years ago, a good friend and his wife were coming back from a vacation, and his wife collapsed on the jetway coming off the airplane coming home. Turns out, make a long story short, she had a tumor about the size of a quarter at the base of her brain that had caused her blackout. She was unconscious but breathing, so they rushed her to a neurosurgeon, basically outpatient surgery. They removed the tumor. She went home that same day. Sort of unbelievable stuff. My friend, her husband, who's my good friend, was marveling at all of the occupations that had to come together to facilitate his wife's healing. I remember him being particularly taken with the imaging software that could help the surgeon pinpoint exactly where the tumor was and to get it out with minimal collateral damage to the brain. And he's reflecting on this. You know what he said? He said, I sure am glad that the person who wrote that imaging software didn't decide to leave their business to go serve the Lord full time. And I think he got it. He got it exactly right.
Yeah.
That the facilitation of his wife's healing was a huge kingdom thing.
Yes.
Because the kingdom advancing is not just what happens in people's souls. What happens in the bodies, what happens in the world too. That counts as kingdom service too. Or else we say that the incarnation didn't matter.
Well, not to mention the fact that we are to be his image bearers, again, going all the way back to Genesis. And as an image bearer, how are you an image bearer if you're never out, if you're never engaged with the rest of creation, if you're only engaged in this small circle? I mean, I think about Acts chapter 2. They found, here's this pouring out of these people, and they found favor in the workplace. That's how people got to know who Christ was, because they found favor with the people who are actually side by side, shoulder to shoulder, working with them in the workplace. That's a pretty stout testimony.
Well, and this is what we need to be careful when we read Genesis 1 correctly, because right after God creates human beings in his image, what does he command them to do? He said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over it.
Right.
And we often put those two, be fruitful and multiply, as synonyms, but they're not. To be fruitful is an economic term, and it refers to being vocationally fruitful, being occupationally fruitful, being productive. Yeah. So be productive and multiply, because you can't do all this on your own, and fill the earth and rule and subdue it. Yeah. So the very first command we get after being made in the image of God, male and female, is to be fruitful.
Fruitful. Yeah. Productive.
Be productive.
Yeah. And it's a big world to be productive in. Yeah.
So tell all the listeners to get off their sorry tail ends and be productive.
Well, I'm just going to say you just told them, which you garner a whole lot more authority in that level than I do. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for coming and giving us a few minutes of your time here. I'm going to invite you back at another time to go dive into the whole side of biblical ethics. But just wonderful. I hope that what we've been able to do today is just give people an inkling of the theology of faith and work, and how that paradigm shift can radically alter how you feel about your work, what you think about your work, what you understand God's saying about your work, and the value that you have, as well as the value of your work in His economy. So, are you going to show me a book?
Self-promotion.
Yeah,
here.
A little shameless promotion here. Yeah,
self-promotion. I have written on the subject called "Business for the Common Good," published by InterVarsity Press. If your listeners want to read a little bit more on the subject, I'd recommend this as a start.
Great, thank you, Scott. Great to see you, even if you're a whole lot older than I am.
Hey.
Yeah, that's the way it is.
I'm not taking the bait, so.